The CPO series is where our world-class chief product officers share their firsthand experiences in building products, building companies, and perfecting their craft. So I'm Christina here from the Dragon Boat team as your host, and I am joined by Kanthi Muthiah, our special CPO series guest speaker for today. So if you're here now and coming in, go ahead and say hello and introduce yourself. You can familiarize yourself with the Zoom chat where you can also ask questions throughout our webinar today. But let's go ahead and get started. Let us know where you're joining and tuning in from. I'm tuning in from Austin, and Kanthi is tuning in from the Bay Area. So let us know where you're joining from. So in the meantime, as we're meeting and greeting, I'll go over a couple quick housekeeping notes before we get started quickly. So this is about a half-hour presentation today. It is a live session that will be recorded and available on demand later with our other CPO series webinars. And as I mentioned, if you have questions for Kanthi as we go, you can submit them for our Q&A session, which will be saved for the very end. So without further ado, we will go ahead and get this started. So the reason we're here today is because of the CPO series, which is hosted by Dragon Boat. And in case you don't know, quick word on Dragon Boat. Dragon Boat enables product leaders to accelerate outcomes with a suite of products for road mapping, portfolio management, and strategic planning. So go ahead and check out dragonboat.io/CPO to learn more. And now it is my pleasure to officially introduce our guest speaker. So Kanthi is an experienced product leader with over 18 years of experience in the fintech space. He's passionate about using technology and data science to serve the underserved and to sustainably create wealth for small business owners and hence the economy. So Kanthi is currently the Chief Product Officer at Funding Circle US. And before that, he's also served as VP of Technical Product Management at FICO, F-I-C-O, sorry if I'm saying that wrong, and was also PayPal's Global Chief Product Officer for Merchant Lending. So you're in very good hands to hear from Kanthi today, which brings us to our topic around launching your CPO journey. So this is going to be all about PDLC insights for new product leaders. So I will go ahead and let Kanthi take it from here.
Can you hear me okay? Shina? Yeah. Thank you. Very excited to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Kudos to the Dragon Boat team for creating the product community here, where we can share all of the best practices, not taking that for granted. Thank you again. So as Christina mentioned, I've been invited to talk about PDLC insights for new product leaders, right? So what we thought was we'll sort of cover in broad strokes 4 areas. What do you do in the first 90 days when you start as a product leader in a new company, new ecosystem? How does an effective sort of like PDLC process look like, right? And how do you evaluate tools in this space? And what are the criteria that we actually use to sort of evaluate tools in this space? And then towards then, how do we create the culture, the PDLC culture? Why is it needed? How do we create a culture which is taking everybody along with us? Not just product and engineering, but rest of the functions as well, right? So those are the 4 sort of broad areas we will cover, and we'll keep some time for questions towards the end, as Christina alluded to. So next slide. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, so I always like to start with people. For me, people, process, and product is where I start the understanding and the assessment, right? So from a people perspective, assessing the skill sets that you have in the first sort of 90 days is very important, right? So again, this itself can be a topic. Like Christine and I were talking right before this, the roles and responsibility and the different functions needed within a product organization itself can be a topic. But on a high level, do we have the product management skill set, which focuses on discovery, solutioning, works more with the business sort of like function? Do we have the product owner skill set, which is more technical, works more with the engineering sort of side of the organization? Do we have design skill set? Do we have research, customer research skill set, market research skill set? Which drives a lot of the product strategy, right? So Also, do we have a good program management sort of like skill set, right? So to drive the PDLC, so to speak. On a high level in broad strokes, those are the skill sets that usually I assess for. And then comes the accountability. This is where the organizational structure, you start to think about what the organizational structure should look like. Typically, I use this best practice of a couple of verticals and a couple of horizontals, right? So what I mean by that is the product type itself can be the verticals and the platform teams can be the horizontal, right? So platforms span across different products. You can have PMs sort of focus on products which are verticals, and then you can have platform leaders sort of like focus on best practices and features that are used across sort of like products, so to speak. That's sort of like a way to sort of start thinking about the organizational sort of structure, the verticals and the horizontal thought process. So that's about the people. Once you have an assessment of what the people sort of things are, you would want to understand what the PDLC process itself is, right? So is the process, do we have repeatability? Do we have predictability in our execution, right? So it boils down to predictability for me. Most of the time, when you interact with the management, like when are we going to deliver this is the first question that we actually get, right? Then comes the how and the details and so on. So predictability in our execution is extremely important, and I actually see the PDLC process and the tools supporting the PDLC process extremely key to bring in predictability. So today we're going to double click on the PDLC process. We'll talk more about what it looks like, what some of the best practices that I usually follow. Then comes the product. What are the types of product and the product strategy itself? What is the strategy that you're walking into? And again, this can be another topic in itself. What is the value proposition that the customer absolutely sort of appreciates in us? What is that revenue strategy, margin sort of like enhancing strategy? What are our strengths which are difficult to sort of replicate from the competition perspective, right? So all of those things go into the product strategy, which drives the prioritization, which sort of like leads into the roadmap development itself, right? So those are the three, I call it the three P's: people, process, and product. Once you have this assessment, Christina, if you want to go to the next slide. Once you have a fair assessment of these three P's, you start listening and mingling with the customer, right? So you have what are their top challenges? I started off by talking to the small business merchants itself in small groups setting, right? And what are the top challenges that they're facing? What do they like in us? What is the primary reason why they have a relationship with us? What are they expecting? What else are we not giving them, right? So diving deep with the customer, understanding what the customer sort of like needs. This is connected to the product strategy, but I'm just sort of explicitly calling it out. For me, in the first 90 days, understanding what the customer says and how do we sort of like deliver value to the customers, right? Which is how efficient are we in delivering value, which comes to the other side of the coin, which is the shareholders sort of things, right? So what's the cost of delivering the value? How does a conversion look like? And these are the L0s. And then if you double click on these L0s, there are L1s and L2s that actually manifest, right? For example, what is the total addressable market? How are we doing against the total addressable market in terms of penetration? All of that sort of like comes up, so to speak. So having an assessment of the cost structure, having an assessment of how the conversion itself looks is a key sort of assessment that a product leader would do in the first sort of 90 days, so to speak. With that, let's go into how the PDLC itself will look like. Keep going, Christina. For me, a good PDLC process, an adequate PDLC process has three layers to it: planning, execution, and monitoring, right? If planning is done really, really well, a lot of the downstream things happens automatically, and this is where tools like Dragonboard also comes into the picture, right? So planning, usually I split it into two pieces, the shorter term planning and longer term planning, right? So we all have the day-to-day aspirations and the longer term strategic sort of aspirations. Both are not going to go away, right? So we need to at some level address both. Typically, I set aside 2/3 of the capacity for longer term planning and 1/3 for the shorter term planning, and it's um, very ecosystem driven, depends on what type of company you are, where you are in your journey, and so on, right? So there is no right or wrong answer, and then you start somewhere which makes sense, and then you sort of like improvise. But the key thing to call out is you, as a product leader, you sort of like set aside the capacity before the planning itself starts, so that the rest of the functions know how to rally around it. So that's planning. We'll look at it in a bit. Execution, I like to break it up into 3 or 4 pieces, right? So at the initiative level, the discovery, which is, do we have the business case? Why are we prioritizing this? Why should we get into execution? Clarity around the customer needs itself, right? So the discovery, and then the solutioning, where we start designing and writing the requirements, and then the dev itself, when we have the sufficient sort of solutioning done, and the release, how do you take it to the market, so to speak. So that's, again, I like to sort of break it out into these 4 pieces. There are no right or wrong answer here, but the idea is to call out that execution itself comprises of 3 or 4 sort of like pieces, so to speak. As a product leader, driving clarity around these sort of aspects of execution is becomes very important. And then comes the monitoring, which is we set the OKRs, and then how are we tracking against the OKRs? And then beyond the planning, there is always improvisation and obstacle elimination that we need to do as we get into execution, right? So which is the readouts, and how do we sort of like improvise as new data points arrive, and how do we sort of drive transparency through these readouts, right? So on a high level, these are the 3 sort of aspects of PDLC. We'll spend a little bit more time on each one of these. Christina, if you want to go to the next slide, please. From a planning perspective, I like to start by defining the swim lanes. I mentioned about the verticals and the horizontals. I typically use the same thought process to define my swim lanes, and then establish intake process for rest of the functions to submit sort of intake at the swim lane level. And then we do a quick t-shirt sizing. The quick t-shirt sizing is to determine whether it belongs to the shorter term sort of planning or the longer term planning, right? So we want to keep the longer term planning true to the product strategy and the longer term strategic sort of objectives, right? So a quick t-shirt sizing is something that I like to do, and then we get into prioritization, which is it's an art and a science. The product strategy needs to drive the priority. We talked about revenue, margin enhancing, the value proposition, the strengths that typically sort of drive a product strategy. Establishing a prioritization process is extremely important, and rallying around the prioritization process so that we all are consistent in how we prioritize this is important. It's easy to say, hard to do, which comes back to driving a PDLC sort of culture across the organization. And then comes, once we have the prioritization process, we get into shorter term planning and the longer term planning. Typically, the shorter term planning can be, it again depends on the ecosystem. I like to do once a month, if needed, twice a month. And the longer term planning, I would say twice a year. But depending on the ecosystem, not more than once a quarter, so to speak. You don't want to change the longer term roadmap too often. As I mentioned, I like to start by setting aside capacity, like 2/3 for the longer term planning, 1/3 for the shorter term planning, so to speak. The outcome of planning is roadmap, right? So driven by detailed capacity and dependency analysis. I've used various tools. Dragonboard is something that I use today, and all of these features are available in sort of like Dragonboard. I really appreciate some of these features that's available through the tool itself. We'll talk about the importance of tool, like why can't we do it in spreadsheets versus why do we need a tool? We'll talk about that in a bit. And then the last sort of comment is around planning is below the line items can be sort of like prioritized as well as backlogs for future planning. Thing is, someone asked about swim lanes. Uh, Again, there is no right or wrong answer here. Let's say there are two products and there is a platform team. You're talking about 3 swim lanes, right? So you have a swim lane for each product, and then you have a swim lane for the platform, sort of like a team as well, and then you have a shorter term and a longer term sort of like roadmap, both for each for the 3 sort of like swim lanes in this example, so to speak. The product swim lanes will be more business oriented, vertical oriented, experience oriented. Platform will be more into the technology, so to speak. If you look at a typical sort of fintech platform, you have top of the funnel CRM, and then you have core sort of payments or underwriting, and then you have post sort of like servicing, post offer servicing sort of aspects in a platform, and then the data piece, which sort of like flows through the entire sort of platform. All of this can be part of the platform team, and the product itself can be sort of like the vertical team. Hope that makes sense. If you want to go to the next slide. So execution, as I said, my preference would be to sort of like do the execution at the swim lane level, right? So if we have like one big sort of roadmap, it becomes very difficult to sort of like go through the execution, drive transparency, and sort of give it the attention that it needs. So typically, I have a 3 in a box for each one of the swim lanes, which is product, engineering lead, and program management. Highly encouraged to identify the N in a box for rest of the functions as well. But for sure, we need product, program management, and engineering for a given swim lane. That would be my preference. Then you sort of like represent which initiative is actually in which sort of like stage, right? The one thing that I would call out here is what determines that discovery is sort of like complete? What are those criteria that determines that solutioning is complete? What determines that development is complete, right? So having an understanding and laying that out in writing absolutely helps. Otherwise, there's confusion. Like, hey, are we in discovery? Are we in solutioning? Can we add requirements now? Like, all of that confusion happens, right? So having clarity around the handover criteria from one stage to the other helps. I'm always for improvisation. I think there's a lot of new data points that arise, and as product managers, we will have to improvise a lot. But at the same time, having the discipline of defining these criteria also helps, right? So it's a balance of both the discipline and the improvisation, so to speak. So that's all I had for the execution. Like, if you want to go to the next slide, Christina. Monitoring, again, highly encourage defining OKRs at the swim lane level, depending on what swim lanes they are. And I like the L0, L1, L2 thought process. Like, what are those L0s? Not more than 2 or 3 metrics. And then you double click on those L0s, you have the L1s and L2s, so to speak, right? So how do you sort of, it goes back to the customer and the shareholder, how do you sort of make sure both sides are represented, and you sort of define these OKRs at the swim lane? So monitoring comes down to tracking these OKRs at the swim lane level. Sometimes you have initiative level sort of OKRs as well. And then the readouts and the bottleneck elimination, right? So if you're stuck on something, if you need resources from a dependency point of view, having those open sort of conversations is all part of monitoring. And for me, having that swim lane, sometimes you can call it a portfolio, and then having OKRs at the swim lane level sort of brings in that visibility, and then you can come up with whatever status coding and so on for you to sort of understand where things are, for the rest of the organization to understand where things are. Typically, once a month, I sort of like do this monitoring readout. And again, it depends on the ecosystem, depends on your need, so to speak. But at least once a month is something that I recommend to drive transparency. I'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so how do you evaluate a tool, right? So about 6-7 months back, when I started in Funding Circle, I was sort of evaluating various tools. And one thing that was very clear was that a tool was needed to drive the PDLC process. Initially, I thought, why not drive it through Word documents and Google Sheets and spreadsheets. The credibility will be lost. It's very error prone, and it cannot be centralized when you do it that way. Right? It becomes very, very difficult. And by having a tool for PDLC, which allows you to do planning, which allows you to do execution, which allows you to do monitoring, drives transparency, allows everybody to contribute consistently into the PDLC tools, so that drives predictability, right? At the end of the day, all of this is efficiency and productivity related. There's a lot of conversation around productivity these days. A PDLC tool is a very good investment to drive that efficiency, to drive that productivity, so to speak. We can talk more if the group wants to, right? And I typically come up with the requirements for planning, execution, and monitoring. The high-level requirements I shared in the planning slide, so to speak, right? So, do we have features to establish swim lanes? Do we have features in the tool to establish intake? How do you define a prioritization logic? How do you then set aside shorter term roadmap, longer term roadmap, and how do you do capacity analysis? All of these are requirements, right? You can score on a scale of 0 to 10 and see how various tools are actually scores against these requirements. There may be specific ecosystem requirements like integration into certain tools. Many of us use Jira, many of us are on Slack, right? So integration into these tools for us to drive intake, for us to drive PDLC is another criteria beyond the detailed requirements and scoring, right? And ease of use by various functions. Product, engineering, program management is comfortable with such tools, but it should be simple enough for other functions like sales, marketing, commercial functions to leverage this tool as well, so to speak. So ease of use is one of the criteria that I actually look for. And then last but not the least, the pricing and the support team itself from the tool. If you have questions and so on, to support the any other requirements that actually come up once you start using the tools, so to speak. So this is roughly the framework that I use. And if you want to keep going, Christina. Yeah. One of the challenges that we all face is a culture of PDLC, right? So product gets it, engineering gets it, but how do we take rest of the organization? This is more art than science, beyond evangelizing the need for a PDLC. We talked about predictability in execution. We talked about efficiency. The document clearly the outcome, like what a PDLC process and a tool can do for a certain ecosystem, right? And taking various functions along with you is very, very important, right? So highlighting the gaps in the current process, highlighting the importance of the PDLC process. The way I did it was once Dragonboat scored high, once I decided to pick Dragonboat, I had demos beyond product and engineering as well with various functions, and I really appreciate Dragonboat's team supporting those conversations, so to speak. There was a key part of creating the PDLC culture. Instead of saying, "Hey, I picked this tool, this is a process," we make them part of the decision making, the leadership team from various functions. And we had a couple of demo sessions before we finalized that this was going to be the tool. And the other thing that goes a long way in inculcating a PDLC culture is the N in a box. We were talking about execution, and I really think having a 3 in a box is a must. 3 being product, program, and engineering for a given swim lane, but extend it to other functions as well. That's the best way to create the PDLC culture, right? So who is the sales representative for a given swim lane, who is the marketing representative, who is the commercial sort of representative, right? So legal, compliance, fintech, legal and compliance is an integral part. So extending the 3 in a box to other functions goes a long way in creating the culture, and then clarifying the roles and responsibility. I see product in the driver's seat whenever there is improvisation that's needed to sort of like help with sort of coordinating and collaborating with various functions. But the roles and responsibilities of various functions, starting from product engineering, program management to other functions, clarifying those roles and responsibility also sort of like helps, right? So that goes a long way in creating the culture. I know we have only 30 minutes, so I think that's all I had, I guess, and we can open it up for Q&A. Christina?
Wonderful. Really packed a punch in those few minutes. So thank you, Kanthi. We'll go ahead and wrap up now and then move to, I see we've got a couple questions coming in. So really thank you again, Kanthi. Lots to consider being a new product leader. So these insights are really valuable to hear, especially just firsthand and from real experience. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Absolutely.
So before we move on to Q&A, I did want to mention some additional resources that you can check out. My friend Anna will be dropping some links in the chat to the resources I'm mentioning. So if you resonated with the conversation today and you want to connect with Kanthi, I'd really encourage you to connect and continue the conversation with him through his LinkedIn. And for other resources to help you achieve faster product outcomes, you can learn how other CPOs and new product leaders like Kanthi have used Dragonboat to really launch their new CPO journey. So see Dragonboat in action and get a demo by visiting dragonboat.io/CPO. You can also get a free responsive product portfolio management certification at responsiveppm.org or download our free ebook on accelerating your outcomes. So now time for the fun stuff. If you still got a question for Kanthi, you can drop it in the chat now. But I'm going to go ahead and kick off the questions. All right. So are you ready, Kanthi?
Yes.
Okay. So I think this first question came in around tracking execution by OKR. So someone, I guess, wants to know a little bit more about how to specifically track those execution by those OKRs.
Yeah. So again, it comes down to how you define the swim lanes, right? So going back to my vertical and horizontal analogy, at the product level, you're let's say there are a couple of products. You have 2 vertical swim lanes, and then you have a platform team. I keep going back to the same analogy for simplicity's sake. For a product sort of like swim lane, I would certainly look at the conversion, right? So what's the conversion? What's the approval rate? If you double click on that, you can actually look at visits to app starts or transaction starts, all of that, right? So very business oriented OKRs. The platform swim lane, you're looking at technical sort of like OKRs, availability, SLAs, number of features, how often you sort of like the features are actually used across different products. All of that sort of like becomes OKRs. Obviously, for the product, the explicit financial sort of like OKRs will be revenue, volume, and so on, depending on which business you are actually looking at, right? So it's very business specific. Hopefully that sort of like in broad strokes gives you some ideas as to how to set the OKR.
Awesome. So we've got some questions around the PDLC. I guess lots of questions around PDLC, but specifically in the tool evaluation. So someone asked which integrations should be must-haves versus nice-to-haves for a PDLC tool in your perspective?
The must-have is we use Jira here in Funding Circle. For me, it was a must-have to sort of like have an integration with Jira. There are much more sort of detailed requirements, acceptance criteria that we track in Jira. So it was very important that the PDLC tools are interacted with Jira. We're also a Slack culture. So we use a lot of Slack in terms of day-to-day sort of execution. So integration with Slack was very important, which I think Dragonboat covered. for us. So philosophically speaking, the engineering sort of requirements where you drive the sprints need to sort of interact with the PDLC tool. That's a must-have.
That's really helpful. And so another question around PDLC tool, do you think PDLC tools are necessary or nice to have? Someone says, how can I manage this without budget for a new tool?
Yeah, so I come from the camp of it's a must-have. It's a very good investment where time and again I see ROI from investing in the tools, right? And I don't think the size of the organization sort of matters. Like small to big organization can benefit from the PDLC tools. With the amount of sort of like improvisation that we need to make as we go through the product development, it becomes a lot of things are simplified when you have a PDLC tool. A strong planning module sort of like makes a huge difference. Allows everybody to sort of like go into the tool and see what the roadmap is, where the planning process sort of ended up, and so on. Starting from those very small sort of common sense things, it sort of allows the transparency, which reduces the chaos and churn. So in my mind, it's a must-have. I've tried sort of PDLC without the tool with very less success.
All right, and we're almost out of time, so we've probably got time for 2 more questions. Is that okay, Kanthi?
Yeah.
All right. Where to pick? Okay. So, how do you control ad hoc developments on basis of customer feedback? And also, how often should the product releases be planned?
Yeah. That's through the shorter term roadmap, right? So the longer term and the shorter term sort of like split is primarily shorter term is equal to run the business, where you look at all of these imperatives, the customer feedback, the quick sort of like wins, sometimes regulatory sort of like imperatives, all of that through the shorter term sort of like improvisation, shorter term roadmap. While not sort of jeopardizing the longer term sort of like outcomes that you're aiming for, right? Having a capacity set aside for the shorter term run the business helps us to stay focused on the longer term sort of like roadmap, needless to say. So that's sort of like is the answer. And then how often is, I typically sort of prefer once a month if possible, as needed, but once a month is, and again, it's a very ecosystem driven question, right? So which business are you in, and so on. But I would say once a month is something that I would actually say works well.
Amazing. And last question here to wrap up our Q&A webinar today is actually a question that I'm going to ask you. So in summary of everything that we've talked about today, Kanthi, we like to ask our speakers, what's the differentiation between a good versus great product leader? So in the context of all of that, how, for a new product leader, what can differentiate a good versus great new product leader?
It comes down to many other things that we discussed, right? So I think having an eye for people is very important, right, for any leader. So people skills are absolutely important. How you sort of invest in the PDLC sort of process, absolutely important. How you sort of go about the strategy itself, the product strategy, right? So I'm more outcome oriented, right? So the outcome orientation, having time bound sort of like outcomes become very, very important in the environment that we are actually in, so to speak, right? And staying very close to the customer. And what are they saying? Are they liking? Are they not liking? What else are they actually looking for, right? So all of these aspects sort of differentiates a good sort of like leader, product leader, I would say. And I think one other skill that I value is, as much as we lay down the discipline, we also should be open for improvisation, right? So that's part and parcel of being a product leader, because there are always new things that come up on a daily, weekly basis. This reflects in that long-term, short-term sort of thought process, so to speak.
Yeah, I like what you said about the delicate balance of it all too.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
All right, that is all the time that we have for today. We didn't get the chance to get through all the questions, but thank you. This was a very hot topic. So maybe we'll have you back on this series again, Kanthi, and we can do a deeper
Sure.
dive into some of these areas. But thank you again to Kanthi for joining our CPO series today, and for everyone who is in attendance. This will be available on demand as well later if you want to watch and share. But otherwise, hoping everyone has a great rest of your day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And thanks again, all.